Welcome everyone to the next video in our series of short videos on Biden's supply chain policies and what in-house counsel and compliance professionals should be aware of and keeping an eye on. This time we're discussing another specific supply chain that the Biden administration has been focused on, and that's the critical minerals and strategic materials supply chain. This includes things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earths, and other materials that the US government has referred to as the building blocks for products used every day. Things from computers to appliances, in the automotive to aerospace sector, and everything in between. And there's an expectation of increasing demand in those products because of the emphasis these days on clean technology and countries' climate goals. These products are, these materials are used in things like wind turbines, electric vehicles, advanced batteries. And in fact, we did record a separate video on large capacity batteries and that particular supply chain. So if you're interested in this topic, you probably also want to watch that video. Last year in June, the Biden administration's Department of Defense issued a report that assessed vulnerabilities and risks for this supply chain, and it proposed policy recommendations. As part of that report, the administration referred to China having an outsized share of the world's refining capacity of these materials. And similar to efforts for other key supply chains, the administration issued policy recommendations prioritizing onshoring, nearshoring, and even ally shoring production and processing of this supply chain. At the same time, for this supply chain in particular, there was a huge emphasis on the need for stronger environmental standards and sustainability, things like supply chain transparency, efforts to combat corruption, efforts to address human rights concerns like forced labor and conflict minerals. Today, I'm joined by three experts: David Hackett, a partner in our Chicago office, who is one of our top experts on environmental law and sustainability and ESG, and Marilyn Batonga and Reagan Demas, partners in our compliance practice in the DC office, focusing on corruption, ESG, and other similar issues. So if I might start with you, David. The report that we saw back in June, like I mentioned, included a lot of emphasis on environment and sustainability. Have you seen the Biden administration take any actions or impose any sort of additional environmental requirements that affect the supply chain that companies should be keeping an eye on or even implementing?
Thanks, Kerry. And from the outset of this administration, there's been a priority focus on advancing ESG sustainability considerations, especially related to climate, including in regards to their impact on the supply chain. I mean, generally, this administration seeks to incentivize and expand markets, as you were just mentioning, focused on clean products, clean tech, and energy, while reducing pollution and emissions. An important part of that agenda, though, is also to push those considerations and objectives through the supply chain. And you can see that in three areas: legislation, regulations, and particularly executive orders. The most recent infrastructure legislation that was enacted it includes extensive requirements on ESG considerations in connection with materials and criteria used in infrastructure, transportation, and energy in particular. But the area that really has seen a lot of development is the executive order area, which has been the major vehicle through which the considerations that you raised are being addressed. That was evident in the supply chain executive order you alluded to, but there's lots of other executive orders before and after that, particularly the December 8th Catalyzing America's Clean Energy Economy through Federal Sustainability Executive Order. Basically, that executive order intends to use the federal government's procurement power, which is $650 billion a year, to compel all agencies to impose ESG requirements on government contractors, providers, and manufacturers with direct impact on suppliers. It, among other things, includes or requires the agencies to develop sustainable acquisition and procurement standards for services and products, including potential standards in federal government food supply chain, with all this to be done through full life cycle cost methodologies. There's a proposed development of a federal supply chain sustainability objectives through procurement policies applicable to all agencies. Importantly, it also proposes tracking disclosure of GHG and other sustainability targets, performance data, and risks of major government suppliers through a supplier disclosure program. CEQ is supposed to develop performance standards, and EPA is going to begin to set product standards. All this also includes recommendations to increase transparency of embodied emissions, including supplier reporting, with procedures for auditing the accuracy of emission data and methods for supporting manufacturers, enhancing their capability to respond to these requests. This is a pretty significant effort underway across all the agencies, and we've been involved with several of them, in which this area is viewed as a major priority with significant hiring of people to help develop requirements over the course of the next year. I might just add, it's also expected that the SEC will release proposed ESG reporting requirements this quarter, which are likely to include Scope 3 emissions. That is reporting of emissions of suppliers in a company's supply chain. So all in all, on a variety of fronts, the government is using, in particular, its procurement power to push its objectives related to ESG through requirements on suppliers and derivatively on their supply chain. Those rules are just being developed now. It's important to watch them carefully. I expect there'll be lots of announcements, rules, proposals, and requirements coming forward this year.
Thanks, David. So yeah, it does sound like companies operating in the supply chain really need to keep an eye on the administration's increased regulatory requirements related to environmental expectations. And switching gears just a little bit to Marilyn, I wanted to ask you about one of the other clear priorities of the administration, which is to tackle corruption in the supply chain. What are you seeing on that front? Have you seen any additional steps taken by the Biden administration that would already increase the risks there, and what more might we be expecting?
Absolutely. I think the Biden administration has been very clear that they see tackling corruption as key to its national security goals, right? And when we look at the June report here, one of the points that was made in the report was that the report really stressed that managing this supply chain was important, not just for the country's economic competitiveness, but for its national security. So there's an alignment there of trying to meet our national security goals by tackling corruption and strengthening the supply chain. For those of us who practice in this area, we know that once you are talking about minerals and strategic materials, you are talking about industries that are considered high risk from an anti-corruption perspective. And these are considered high risk because of the number of government touch points. If you take the example of minerals, from exploration and prospecting to construction of a mine to exploiting and exporting minerals, there are a number of licenses and permits that have to be obtained, which means that there are multiple opportunities to make improper payments to government officials. We also know that there are only a limited number of countries that are producers of these strategic minerals and materials. And these include countries that the Biden administration sees as not playing by the rules. And the administration, therefore, has an interest in ensuring that corruption does not provide the leaders in these countries the means to move forward with whatever agenda they may have that is not aligned with U.S. interests. But there's also, in addition to the tackling corruption as part of national security interests, there's also the practical reality that you need to address corruption in the supply chain if you want to address all the other vulnerabilities in the supply chain. So when you look at the June report, the Biden administration identified a number of vulnerabilities in the supply chain, including human rights abuses or environmental concerns, which David talked about, issues related to forced labor and child labor. And if you want to strengthen this supply chain by addressing these vulnerabilities, you have to address corruption, because most of these jurisdictions already have laws in the books that are prohibiting child labor. They already have a mining code that addresses environmental concerns. But part of the reason that we have these issues that are still persisting is that enforcement efforts are thwarted by corruption.
Thanks, Marilyn. Reagan, I wanted to turn to you with a question about a policy recommendation that was in the report that we saw issued back in June. And that was that the Biden administration proposed some new disclosure obligations related to so-called conflict minerals. Can you tell us a bit about that and what companies should be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kerry. So, the original conflict minerals rule, which is now 9 years old, right, that was put in place prior to the Trump administration, was essentially gutted by federal courts in the course of the Chamber of Commerce and some other industry groups that were really focused on trying to limit its impact, because it was seen as pretty onerous for companies at the time. That required certain disclosures about conflict minerals, but really was focused on 9 countries in Central Africa and only 4 minerals, right? The 3T plus G that they talk about: tungsten, tantalum, tin, and gold. So that has been, a lot of companies scrambled at the time to put in place some sort of process for mapping supply chains as it relates to these particular minerals, and still continue to report, and even though there's essentially no enforcement at this stage. But we know that that's going to change. Because of what you just mentioned in terms of the reports, they've told us it's going to change. But we also know that politically, the administration has an interest in sort of reinvigorating, giving new life into the conflict minerals regulations and obligations. Now, how might that happen? I mean, it could happen. David mentioned the upcoming ESG disclosures that the SEC is working through now as part of the task force work on ESG. It's possible that it's integrated into that. It's possible that something touches on that, and then they build on that and build off of what actually came originally, the authorization for the SEC to put in place the conflict minerals rules and regulations. But what we know are a few things about what's likely to change. So first of all, they're going to work around the thing that really gutted the original rule, which was the requirement that companies essentially say that they're conflict or not conflict free, and which was seen as a First Amendment issue, corporate First Amendment issue. So they'll work around that. There are plenty of ways they can do that. And one of the things we know they will do likely is expand the areas. As Marilyn mentioned, there are other areas that are being impacted by corporate bad behavior and corruption and everything that goes with it, including conflict zones, other than just Central Africa. And so we're likely to see an expansion in the areas of the world where sourcing is going to be monitored. The other thing is we're likely to see additional minerals covered. There's only those 4 minerals I mentioned, the 3T plus G. But if you think about, you mentioned lithium batteries, cobalt, other key minerals that are in some of these strategic, like semiconductors, that the administration is just last week was pushing on, really encouraging onshoring and nearshoring. That's great, may or may not work. But the reality is even if the administration gets companies to produce more of this in the US, you still are going to have to source these minerals outside of the US. These are not that you can't sort of source the ultimate minerals, change the sourcing of that, right? So what we're going to see, and I think the answer for most companies is just be prepared to be able to map and get ahead of the curve before these rules come out. Have some mapping of some of these minerals in your supply chains. Many companies can build off of what they did do at the time the SEC rule came in place. If you haven't done that, time to catch up, right? To make sure you're ready for that. But we know it's coming down the pike, and the question is sort of what will it look like?
So Reagan, given all the uncertainty around that, a lot to watch out for, what would you say companies should be focusing on right now?
Yeah, I think, just to tie a bow on everything that's been said, I think the points that everyone said, the key theme here is there's more regulation coming as it relates to corporate behavior and ESG and supply chains, right? So what should companies be doing? I mean, keep an eye on the regulations as they come out, obviously, so you can comply. But the general theme and the one thing that companies can do to mitigate this risk is to put in place compliance programs that cover supplier activities. Corruption, for example, as Marilyn mentioned, historically, supply chains were not an area where the US government was really focused on enforcement efforts as it relates to the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That's likely to change, right? So that's one area we're thinking, how can I expand or incorporate supplier activities into like an FCPA compliance program? Same thing with sourcing minerals, being able to sort of understand where some of these critical minerals or conflict minerals, as they call them, come from in your own supply chain will help you respond to inquiries or be ready to disclose as needed under new regimes. Those are the main areas, just increasing transparency and also increasing compliance program coverage of supplier activities to be ready for these new regulations as they arrive.
Okay, well, one thing that you can also do is to check out our other videos and our upcoming videos. We have several of them either already posted or in the works. We've got one on general trends, as well as other videos on specific supply chains. And that includes large capacity batteries, which does, as I mentioned earlier, have a pretty significant overlap with this supply chain on critical minerals. So I would suggest if you're interested in this discussion, you also check out that discussion, and also semiconductors and pharma and active pharmaceutical ingredients. Hope to see you all soon. Thanks.